What if we could redesign everything? Welcome to the DIF, the world's largest online festival of ideas, and you're joining us for another session at the beginning of week 3 here. My name is Seb, and I'll be the host of this session. We're going to be talking about AI, and we've all heard a lot about AI over the last few years in relation to work, our jobs, what it means to be human, perhaps, and disruptions across industry and just about every aspect of human life. And today we're going to be taking a bit of a philosophical dive into what this really means beyond some of those topics, hopefully. And I'm joined by Michael and Tamara from Out of the Box Insight to give us that perspective. But just as crucial as their opinions is what we get from you. The DIF is designed to be interactive, and we really want your questions, your comments, your feedback. We've got these guests here for half an hour, and we really want you to challenge them and ask the tough questions. And I know that's exactly what they want as well. Let's have a conversation for these next 30 minutes. And there's a few different ways that you can input into this conversation. One is using the comments box that you should find just to the right-hand side of the video stream if you're watching via thinkdiff.co. And the other two ways are either using hashtag ThinkDiff on Twitter, or you can use the YouTube comment space as well if you've already navigated to the live stream on YouTube. So feed those comments and questions in. My colleague Leo is watching the session, and he'll be feeding those through to me, and I will put them to Michael and Tamara. So we look forward to receiving those. Michael, during the DIF last year, we had a session with David Weinberger, a big author on AI and those technologies. And one of the things he said, one of his hypotheses, I suppose, is that actually our machines are getting smarter than us. Is that true?
I'm not sure that the word smarter is an appropriate word, but it is doing something extraordinarily different than human beings do. A couple years ago, AI made a tremendous leap by, instead of trying to identify, let's say, a cat, by trying to count each pixel and trying to understand what that cat looked like, the programmers did something quite extraordinary. They just showed it pictures of tens of thousands of cats, and it was able to then assemble a pattern of what a cat looked like. That same kind of AI principle is now being applied to medical diagnosis. So AI can now scan through hundreds of tens of thousands of millions of X-rays to be able to find and diagnose medical issues equally and sometimes even better than humans can. Now, there's something fundamental about how artificial intelligence is programmed. To see patterns requires inductive reasoning. Human beings have been trained to think deductively, to see small numbers of data points and do things in a really calculative, direct way. AI sees patterns. And there's something much more profound than just simply seeing patterns. The patterns represents interconnectivity between multiple strands of life. Human beings have been trained just to sort of see things in a silo, to see things in different categories, different time constraints. AI puts it all together.
There's something, I know famously there's this argument that AI can't be smarter than us. I think the Turing test is what comes to mind as an example of showing that AI isn't as clever as us. But the Turing test kind of tests an idea of an intelligence that is basically based on the idea, can AI get better at thinking like a human? Is that a fair thing to say? And actually, the way in which AI is developing is to think completely differently from the way in which we would grade intelligence amongst other people.
Exactly. In fact, a couple of years ago, economists thought it was going to be impossible for computers to be able to do medical diagnosis because they had that particular concept in mind, that they would never be able to think as a human being thinks. But it's not just simply a matter of how we think, it's the matter of the problems that we are now facing. There are what are called intrinsic motivators and extrinsic motivators. We have been living in an environment where we tend to solve problems because we're being paid to solve problems. And the problems that we're being paid to solve are pretty mechanistic, mechanical, time-sensitive problems. So back in the 1940s, a Gestalt therapist by the name of Carl Duncker did something quite famous called the candle experiment, or the candle problem. And in essence, what it is, he comes out and with a stopwatch going, the participant is given a candle with a box of tacks and said, in a certain time limit, place that candle onto the wall. And because they're under pressure in the time, they can't do it. But stand back, and without time and creativity, it's quite easy. You take the tacks out of the box, tack the box onto the wall, and put the candle onto the box. And that's the nature of the modern problems that we are beginning to be faced with. We are going to need creativity, collaboration. The British historian Niall Ferguson had made an observation that what made the West so profoundly successful over the past couple hundred years was our ability to compete. And so he said the West versus the rest, and that primary thing of competition. But if we're trying to discover the cure for cancer, or to find solutions for environmental protections, et cetera, competition is still maybe going to be part and parcel to what human beings do, but we're going to require a much more collaborative process. And we don't really do that yet very well.
I was actually going to ask you what types of problems sort of classify in this spectrum you're speaking about, but maybe a good follow-up question to what you just said is, are you saying that we need AI to solve those problems?
Okay.
Or are you saying actually that AI isn't essential to, AI is a sort of tool that we can harness?
Yeah. Look, I want to try to take you back into a time machine.
That sounds good, Michael.
Okay, back in the 1930s and 1940s, there were two economists, one a French guy and a British guy. They worked independently for a while, and then they came together. And basically what they did is they created a database of all human beings throughout time and what it is that they did in terms of labor. And so they categorized human activity, human behavior, into three categories: agriculture and mining, anything that took something away from the land; mass production; and then services. So there were three fundamental paradigms as to what human beings did. But the second important observation that they made is that as technology impacts the first paradigm, it also prepares the second paradigm. When technology comes into the agricultural field, as an example, and it removes or it begins to reduce or replace the demand for human labor in that first sector of agriculture, that human sector then goes into mass production. But the percentage of the labor force in mass production had already peaked in 1939. And so we saw a decline, and 72 to 79% of the human population now resides in the services sector. Now, AI is also now beginning to replace that technology or that demand for human labor, but it is also preparing the way for this fourth paradigm that we haven't yet defined. And when we begin to use, when we take one piece of the puzzle, AI, and take another piece of the puzzle, distributive networks.
What do you mean by distributive networks? Just to
Okay. We live in a world of hierarchies: political hierarchy, corporate hierarchy, social hierarchy. And a supply chain, as an example, is there's you're taking hundreds, thousands of inputs into how to assemble a car. So you may have steel coming from one location, plastic from another location, the seat belts coming from another location. And all of this is being integrated and controlled non-centrally. Hierarchical means that there's some sort of central control. Distributive networks means that it's sort of a natural controlling element, that there are feedback loops. And part of the process that we do not have in place is for people like you and I to sort of jump into these distributive networks. Quite often, people are in what is called network isolates. They're not even connected to a network. Um, think of any company. One of the things that we've tried to address is something called intellectual property. In America, in particular, a few companies are doing intellectual property transfer, technology transfer. And that means that somebody may have developed a piece of technology to accomplish a very specific task. There's another entity that can go to that first company and say, look, let's market your technology to hundreds, thousands of other different companies. And if they do participate in that, that technology then is spread out throughout the world. You and I have less of an opportunity to be able to do that. We do it sort of in social media, but not from a value generation point of view. 1958, a guy by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a book called The Affluent Society. And what he was basically saying, he was seeing where we are today, back in 1958, the year I was born, 60 years ago. And basically what he said, that human beings were no longer collaborating together as a community of people for the specific purpose of survival, of food, clothing, shelter. That what they were doing now was doing things somewhat collaboratively whenever it suited them for luxury items. Now, this is important because I want to take you back into that time machine again and go back to a primitive civilization. Somebody would go and buy a hammer. They would go home and make something with that hammer. They would make a table, a chair, and then they would resell that new product that they just made with the hammer that they just consumed, and it would create a circular economy, so to speak. But this was a circular economy that goes all the way back to primitive days. When we buy something, whether it's a smartphone or a shirt or a piece of meat, we don't really do anything with it. It's consumed. And therefore, networks and artificial intelligence and a few other things, when you combine them together, will then be able to allow us to consume intellectual property, to consume your experience in, let's say, social media marketing, and somebody's experience in typography, somebody's experience in miniature puppeteering, and bring them all together to create some kind of value.
Wow, we've got quite a few big topics that we've covered already.
Right.
So the idea that machines and AI think fundamentally differently than us. The idea of this this combination of technology and distributed networks being kind of the beginnings or the key of a sort of fourth paradigm solution to some of the problems that we've also touched on, and there have been 3 types of work. I wanted to maybe just zero in, because it's often the starting point for a lot of people, I think, on
Sure.
the topic of AI, is work. That's the thing we hear so much about.
And that's serious.
Yeah.
But it's that overlooks a lot of the other subtleties that are underneath that.
And I think so. One of the things that you mentioned was, the erosion of the three different types of work as articulated by the authors of the economists in the 30s.
Right.
Should people be worried about that? I guess is a question that we are often asked in these types of sessions. I'm sure someone is already typing it now, so I'm going to anticipate you and ask it. Well, should people be stressed or worried about the potential of jobs being taken away from the economy or from our lives?
Yeah, well,
that's a big question for you, Mike, obviously, to answer.
No, yeah. Well, because when you say the word job, throughout history, people participated in a particular job to support the community. The hunter-gatherer, as an example, or the person that built the shelter. And there was a sense that you could see what people were doing. You could trust the person that was moving the plow. You could trust the plow. It was tangible. You could see it. We don't know what to trust anymore. How do you trust an algorithm? Or how do you trust a biophysicist locked in some sort of private room somewhere doing something? And this process of work has even deeper consequences to the social fabric and what I think most people would call the social narrative, the human narrative. What does it mean to actually be human? And at least I grew up, and I'm sure you grew up too, in a time or when in a social culture that said work is virtue. Well, if automation and artificial intelligence and other things are ultimately going to reduce our demand for physical materialistic labor, then what do we do? Ken Webster mentioned this, I think, in the very first introductory thing for this year. He called it agency. But agency presupposes that there is a society that is somehow needing each other to operate as a society. And I suppose one could observe that what we're beginning to see is a fracturing of a society understanding that it does need each other. Margaret Thatcher once famously said, "We do not have a society." And you're beginning to see that through the nationalistic movements. If we can get to a point in which we can have a conversation about these deeper issues that relate to what it means to be human in the modern sense and the narratives that we have told ourselves, things about virtue, things about identity. There's a Dutch documentary a couple years ago called The Sea That Thinks. And the documentarians were walking on the street saying, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" And everybody would respond, "Well, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm an architect." And they said, "No, no, 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 that's what you do. Who are you?" And so if this fourth paradigm, it's not going to be something where I or you or someone else will, point a flag and say, "Come follow me here." If part of the problem is the fact that human beings have been sort of disengaged from the day-to-day operations of the world, the politics of the world, getting to know how the world actually operates in a technical way, do we keep on propelling that forward, or do we actually then pose to the masses that they are going to have to roll up their sleeves and get involved in the day-to-day processes and the responsibilities of life. And if that then becomes the fourth paradigm, the fourth way in which we even ask the question, what is value?
I think it's really interesting. I think what you're saying there resonates from the point of view that the reason people feel so concerned about AI and jobs is because what I think what you're saying is that actually it's not just a job, it's a sense of identity, it's a sense of work, and almost across the political spectrum, for example,
Right.
there's almost no political campaign that's ever been run that hasn't mentioned in some way they're trying to create new jobs or some kind of work related promises. One of the questions we've had in actually from Jean speaks to one of the other practical considerations, as well as that, who are you? I'm a lawyer. Point of view is, does an end of labour not mean an end of income? And I sort of ask you this question, understanding, that you're a thinker and writer on the topic, and not necessarily, you haven't got a manifesto that you're defending here, but it's an interesting question, isn't it? What does it mean when actually not only is our sense of, well, not only, that's quite significantly, our sense of identity is tied up in our work, but also actually our means of existing are tied up in our jobs. We work, we get money, we can spend that money. We create and sell things. The whole system is built around our work.
Well, yes, and the nature of how we assembled that work is that we tended to work for someone. We either worked for a landowner back in the old days, or we worked for a corporation or whatever it was. And now what we're seeing with the gig economy, et cetera, that individuals become their own agents, right? And it's now peer-to-peer. The fundamental challenge, though, in that, the OECD has projected that within 2 years, by 2020, 2/3 of all laborers on the planet will be operating in what is called the shadow economy. When you tend not to want to pay taxes, you tend not to want to support the social spectrum. When you have when you're participating in this peer-to-peer process. And so what we've attempted to do is, when we talk about what that fourth paradigm might look like, we have a concept, we have a vision, but we want to be careful about how we pose that, because there are literally millions of visions or potentialities out there. What we find to be most important is for the general public to come together and start to address this. So here is one particular avenue, and it's not the avenue that we are saying human beings ought to do, it is a potential vision. A couple years ago, Google Maps and the Financial Times did a little special thing. And you could go from one town to another town, and it would show you, in fact, you could do it now on Google Maps. Where is the local sports arena? What are the local restaurants and bars that are highly accredited, etc.? Where's the local movie theater? But does it show you where the local chess players are, or the local marketing people are, or the local computer nerds are, or the local philosophers are? Or if you wanted to go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, but you weren't really all that knowledgeable about Van Gogh, is there somebody that lives in Amsterdam that would go to the museum with you, that would be able to communicate to you the deeper elements of Van Gogh? So are there human relationships that are of value? And that's kind of the question that we're trying to open up, is that perhaps this fourth paradigm is ourselves. And it's mathematically hard to even contemplate that. In fact, I think some of the presenters that you've had on this past couple of weeks have said that it seems to be an impossible thing, on how do you value something that is of quality. Human beings have valued quantity. I've got $1, you've got 5 apples. How many, how many apples can I buy for my dollar? And so we think quantitatively, but what if we began to think qualitatively and we begin to share experiences? Uh, Even a subtle moment. It's a Friday or Saturday night. You're sitting at home with the family, and you've had a tough week in the office. A lot of pressure. Some people may be getting fired, or there's just a lot of pressure going on. And you look around the table at your family and say, well, let's go see a movie. The purpose of you going to see the movie is not really for you to go see the movie, but it is to unwind and get rid of the pressure. But what if you were in an environment which you didn't feel that pressure in the first place? I think they just did a poll in your country, in the UK, like something astronomically, 70% of labor force literally hates their job. So maybe artificial intelligence replacing these jobs that we don't really like might be a very good thing. The question is, how do we as human beings begin to establish relationships with each other? And do we value those relationships? How do we value them? And how do we put all the pieces of the puzzle together in terms of making this sort of a formal economic process, or do we?
So we've got some great questions coming in. Thank you very much to the viewers who are posting those through, and I'll be feeding those in a moment. I just wanted to I think there's something in what you were just talking about that I just wanted to sort of try and loop on, I guess, is because I think it's interesting what you're saying is we're kind of in a place where we need a vision, or some sort of concept or vision would help to a discussion or a conversation about a concept of vision would be powerful. What I suppose, and I think maybe that you mentioned it, is it's that mental leap from how perhaps it's going to be a quite a radical fundamental shift in the way we think, and so it's not as simple as this is a more productive way to do things, or we at the Animal Car Foundation talk about the circular economy, which is a vision for an economic model which is quite tangible in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
What are the fundamentals or the core things that form the vision that you're kind of talking about, where potentially enabled by AI, there's kind of a new thinking about what it is to be human and the kind of society we want to live in? What are some of the buckets of or categories, I guess, for building that vision or idea? How will it ever be presented, I guess, or shared?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's a difficult question.
No. Again, what our primary objective at this point is just simply to get people to understand that there is this literal human evolution that is beginning to happen. And instead of sort of blindly going to the next phase, we have the technology in front of us. There's nothing that we have to go out and invent. We've got the network, but instead of using the network to watch cat videos, we could be using the network to interconnect people with not just even like-minded. Sometimes you want people that have contrasting views, and to be able to find the positive elements of one side and the positive elements of another side. So what we've tried to do is we start one chapter with Tabula Rasa. The chapter name is Tabula Rasa. And if we use it as a thought experiment, not that it's possible, technically possible this might happen, but within 20 years, artificial intelligence and automation can provide all 7 billion plus human beings on this planet with the basic necessities of life: food, clothing, shelter. nothing extravagant, just the basics, then what do people do with their lives? And the question becomes, what do people want to do with their lives? We have that capacity now to begin to ask that question. And it could take shape in anything and everything that we wanted to do. But again, we have been trained to think quantitatively. I need you, Seb, to come over to my house and paint the outside of my house. Now,
I'm not available, Michael.
Oh, sorry. Everybody in any country knows what the mathematical calculation for that is. Somebody's going to be calculating how much paint they need. How big is my house? How much paint will I need? Do I want low quality paint, medium quality paint, high quality paint? How many hours will it take you to paint that house? That's the standard that we now have, quantitative. But what if I ask you, Seb, can you come to my house? I have a 10 meter by 10 meter space in my study that I'd like to have something quite imaginative painted there, a beautiful landscape, something that allows me to sit in a chair and look at that painting and contemplate it and let my mind go somewhere. Now, how much will you charge me to do that? And that's a real difficult place for people to put their heads. If there's any graphic designers or something listening to this, they will know precisely that people don't feel comfortable paying for creativity. But markets are whatever we want them to be.
I think that's very in line with the point that Ken was making in the launch session, was that the economy is not a force of nature.
Right.
It is created by decisions, and somehow it's been reframed in that way. I want to get to a couple of these questions that come in. So sure. Jojo Miller is especially interested, I think, in the relationship between humans and AI. I should say, by the way, that you really hooked her in with your cat analogy to open up the session. She says she really likes cats. So, but just two. So she's asked two, I think, quite linked questions. One is, let's see what it says. It says, what's the? So I'll read the question just so you get the full context. Which is, are you saying that AI and humans collaborate in different ways, i.e. that the criteria for collaboration is different? AI is better at patterns, humans more selective. And if that's the case, does that mean there's always going to be a role for humans and AI going forward? And she followed up that question with a further question, which was, how can we ensure that humans and machines are able to cohabit and complement each other for an effective society and avoid apocalyptic disaster? Perhaps she's seen some of the, certainly a consumer of popular culture, which has not depicted the relationship between AI and humans in a positive way all the time.
Right. Look, let's just take a hypothetical in the future. You, Seb, wake up one morning and something has happened. You've seen a particular photograph, you've read a particular book, light goes on inside your head. And as a consequence, you get on the computer, keyboard, you're typing in a few things. AI is working right next to you, through you. And it knows precisely where it is that your mind is going now that you started typing. And you've got an idea of a particular, maybe an invention or a particular way to put two pieces of technology together that will help you to see something under the ocean at a particular depth. And this could be the breakthrough that allows us to see and experience something we've only mapped out less than 1% of the ocean floor. Now, if humanity made a decision, this is something that we ought to go do, is explore the ocean for a lot of different reasons. We only eat 8 species of meat. and I think 14 or 15 species of vegetables and non-meats. There's obviously thousands, millions of other species out there. Maybe we're looking for species deep under the ocean, and you, Seb, have figured out a way to do that. And so what AI is doing is connecting your thoughts and also starting to connect with other people out there. And these other people are also engineers, and some of them might in fact be lawyers. Some of them might be people that operate virtual reality machines, because we all know that hundreds of millions of people can't start to go into the ocean. So all of this information is being collected and disseminated through hundreds and thousands of people that are beginning to collaborate with each other. But there's also what we've tried to construct is when we think of governance, we tend to think of government. But one of the things that we're trying to communicate is that these more sophisticated networks will be able to create what is called a negative feedback loop. And if we are aware in real time what is going on with these various different things, then at some point we can take a moment and say, now let's put this through game theory, right? So we're about to, you've identified a particular plant under the ocean. We've one of the previous things have talked about the unintended consequences of using something like a pesticide. Well, there are unintended consequences of doing things in a positive way. It was once thought that the printing press destroyed our memories, etc. But what if we went under the ocean and explored this particular plant? Everybody working together, thousands of people with AI. We could still stop for a moment and use game theory to be able to see how this projects forward, small, in the short term, medium term, and long term. The short end of the story is that AI and human beings think differently, we collaborate differently, but we can also collaborate and think. We can use those nuances to our benefit. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that's a helpful reframe of that question. I realised that we've gone over time. That's the nature of talking about AI and the future of humanity. I do have one more question I just want to get to because it came in a little while ago now. So John asks, what role does power play in this? Does the shift have to come from the bottom of the pyramid? I wonder if he's picking up on, I think you mentioned the general public at one stage earlier in terms of shift. Obviously we know that power structures, massively govern shifts of this scale.
Okay, the answer to that is pretty clear. In fact, I'm gonna quote something that, in fact, Ken Webster quoted by Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And in essence, that's what it is that we're technically what it is we've tried to put into the book is that if you develop this fourth economy, we use some weird mathematical calculations that goes all the way back to quantum physics, and biomimicry to be able to try to figure out how these relationships can work together, but also how to put some sort of value to them. And we've estimated that roughly 50% of the human population could start to go into that new fourth economy. We're not going to get rid of the first economy. We'll always have agriculture. We'll always have labor in agriculture. We'll always have mass production. We'll always have labor in mass production. We'll always have services and always have labor in services. But as we develop this new fourth economy, it will become temporarily a parallel process. But hopefully there are positive things that will feed back into the previous three paradigms and back and forth. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's So yes, hopefully that answers your question, John. Thank you so much, Michael and Tamara, for joining us for the session. Thank you so much to our audience for your attention and also for those questions and comments. This obviously is a huge area of conversation. I don't think 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or an hour could cover it, and it's part of why we do the DIF, to try and join up conversations. Michael, you've mentioned a couple times about a book that you guys have authored. Do you just want to give us the title of that, so if anyone does want to search for it and read more about you and Tamara's views and what you've authored?
Sure. It's just called Wealth Beyond Nations. It's a play on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's free in a PDF file on our website, www.outoftheboxinsight.com. But if you want to buy it, it's on Amazon and other places as well.
Fantastic. So yeah, Wealth Beyond Nations. Yeah, so, you know, what do people want to do? I think that was the question that really provoked me from this session. And that's potentially the world that that's a question that potentially the world of AI allows us to ask, and move away from quantitative assessments of our time and the way in which we operate to something a bit more complex potentially and a bit more qualitative.
Exactly.
But thank you so much for Michael and Tamara for your time. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us, and we hope to see you again at the DIF. There is actually another film that, if you're interested in this subject, that could be highly relevant for you. We just released today. It's called Why Should You Actually Care About the Future of Work, with Azim Azar, who's a early stage tech investor and author on AI, the future of work and related topics. He's in this film created at the Tate Britain Museum. He talks to our very own Joe Isles. So do check that one out, and we hope to see you during this final week of the DIF. We have 8 or 9 live sessions every day, so something for everyone, hopefully. Thank you again so much for joining us, and hopefully see you again soon.